Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the session on how to modernize your continuous integration using sandboxes. My name is Rohit Mehta, and I'm a product manager on the Salesforce DX product management team. Joining me today is Jing Qian, who is a lead engineer on our environments team. Now, this being day 2, I'm sure you've seen this slide at least a half dozen times, but just a quick reminder that all purchasing decisions need to be made on generally available products. Now, this is one of my favorite slides to show because it perfectly captures all the different tooling that Salesforce provides developers on the platform. You have code editor plugins to make your changes, such as in the VS Code editor. There's a scriptable interface in the Salesforce CLI. There are environments for developing changes, such as Scratch orgs, developer sandboxes. There's declarative tooling in the form of app builders, process builders, and so on. And then there's also environments for testing. In addition to this, there's also a couple of different release management tools at your disposal in the form of chain sets and packaging. In addition to the tooling, there are 2 different models of development on the Salesforce platform. The first one involves modifying all the metadata that's part of your production org, in which case you make changes to the metadata, and you then deploy this metadata from one org to the other until finally you deploy it to production. That's called chain set development. We also sometimes refer to it as org-based development. The other model of development involves creating these modular, immutable artifacts of metadata that can be then installed in any environment, such as your sandbox or your production org, and that's called package-based development. Now, regardless of the 2 types of development, continuous integration can be used in either of them. So, what is chain set development? Right? As I mentioned, you're modifying changes, you're modifying metadata in your production org. And so you're typically starting off with some metadata-based sandbox, such as a developer sandbox or a developer pro sandbox. Now, depending on the complexity of your team and your project, you might need several of these sandboxes. You might need a sandbox for integration, you might need a sandbox for testing, and then finally for staging UAT before you can deploy your changes to production. Again, as teams and complex projects grow in size, you need a central repository in the form of a version control system where you can manage all your team's changes over time, version these changes, and also have a place to merge your conflicts. With greater demands from business, there's always this need to deliver applications and innovations faster. And it comes at the expense of quality sometimes. This is where continuous integration and continuous delivery is very important. So what is continuous integration? Continuous integration is the development practice where every developer checks in code into a shared repository several times a day. And during each of these commits into the repository, there's an automated build that gets kicked off, which runs a series of tests so that you can catch any flaws, any bugs before they make themselves into production. With chain set development, you can use sandboxes to run CI and CD. Sandboxes can also be used in package development in much the same way. Instead of building changes in a sandbox, you build these changes in Scratch orgs, and the changes being in the form of packages, those immutable artifacts that I mentioned previously. And then instead of installing these changes, or instead of moving these changes from one org to the other, you install these packages in each of the different environments. Again, CI and CD plays the same role, in which case you can automate this entire pipeline. So now that you know what CI means, let's get into the specifics around what it means to set up continuous integration. First of all, you need some tools to orchestrate this entire process. You need a CI system. There are several third-party systems that Salesforce plays well with, such as Travis, Circle CI, Jenkins. There's a whole slew of them. The second is a VCS. VCSs are the version control systems where developers check in their code, and these VCSs have hooks that can trigger CI builds. Finally, you need a scriptable interface so that you can write down all the series of operations that you want to perform when a check-in has been made. You also want to establish your environment. An environment that's apt for continuous integration is one which you can reproduce. so that if an issue or a flaw is found, the developer can then run the same series of tests, find the same flaw, and then diagnose that flaw. It's also important to run the right tests at the right time. Early on in your development cycle, you can imagine that a developer wants to run a bunch of different unit tests that test all their changes that they're directly touching. However, as you move down the pipeline closer to production, you're running a much larger series of end-to-end tests or integration tests. Finally, it's important to keep the build clean. This means running tests on every check-in, making sure that those tests are run several times a day and several times before those changes make into production. You also want to reject code promotions if they break a build. You don't want to make those flaws and those bugs get into production. Finally, you want to report those failures and then track down the developer and have that development team fix those bugs and iterate over this process. So let's go over a typical workflow. I call this typical because I've seen a lot of teams develop and embrace this. However, different teams and different projects may choose to build their continuous integration and their version control strategy differently. In this example, I have my code repository's master branch synced up with the state of the production org. And then I have a branch for staging as well as for integration for my developers, which is the develop branch. At the start of development, each developer checks out code from the develop branch and then uses this to sync up his or her developer sandbox. This is their own environment where they're making their changes. As you can imagine, whenever they make a change, they run this series of local tests, open up the org, and do some manual testing. When the first developer is ready to merge his changes back into the develop branch, it kicks off a series of tests, which is in the form of a CI build. The second developer is missing these changes, so that developer will pull down the changes from the develop branch, merges with his local changes, and then run some local tests again. When those changes are ready to be merged with develop, you can imagine that the same tests are run all over again. And so these tests are getting repeated over and over again with very little touch point from the developer. Everything is happening in the background with the help of CI, and it's making sure that code quality is stable. These changes finally make themselves into the staging branch, where again you have an integration suite that's running more end-to-end tests, and then finally into production. Now, we know that sandboxes have been used with CI and CD in the past, but it's not always been easy to use them. We've got this very great quote from a developer who said, CI/CD with Sandbox is a very painful process. Please give us a more professional way to do it correctly. Getting into the specifics, some of the challenges have been that there hasn't been an easy-to-use scriptable interface. We've had Sandbox APIs for a while, but we have not had something where you can quickly just spin up a sandbox using something like the Salesforce CLI. We've also required customers to manually log into a sandbox to create a connected app because there was no connected app or no way to headlessly authenticate into a sandbox. Finally, failing tests can sometimes require that sandboxes be restored to the original state. So it's not best practices to keep reusing the same environment. Now, I'm pleased to announce that in summer 19, we've tried to solve all of these different problems. First of all, we have updated the Salesforce CLI's org topic to include commands around creating, cloning, and deleting sandboxes. We've also introduced a new API in beta, which allows you to headlessly authenticate into sandboxes, and that API has been integrated into the Salesforce CLI. Finally, sandbox cloning can be used to create disposable environments that are created from a known state. So now that we've given you an overview of all the different ways that CI can be used with sandboxes, let's check it out in practice. I'm going to hand it over to Jing to give you a quick demo.
Thank you, Rohit. So Rohit and I are developers building on top of Salesforce platform. And Rohit just got assigned a very nasty bug. So how's that going?
Bugs are never fun.
I'm sorry to hear that. Where I actually got to work on this killer feature for our application. And I have already coded up, tested it in my developer sandbox. So what I need to do now is to integrate my changes into my main code repository. Now, I'm hoping the continuous integration setup that we have will give me some assurance by running more extensive integration testing to ensure that my killer feature doesn't actually kill my production. So what does continuous integration actually do? How does it work? So let's start with some prerequisites. First, we will need a scripting tool, and that is the Salesforce CLI. I need to be able to install Salesforce CLI. Then we're talking about continuous integration, so that means there's no menu intervention. Nobody's sitting there typing in their username and password. So I need to be able to authenticate into my production org headlessly. Luckily, I have connected app set up on my production org using the JWT bare flow. Next, I will need a centralized code repository. So in this case, I'm using GitHub. Last but not least, I need a CI tool that can integrate with my code repository, in this case, which is GitHub, that can take my rules that I set up to say, anytime I'm making changes, you better kick off a auto build to run those tests to give me some assurance. So let's take a look. All right, like I said, I'm ready. I did all my testing. All I need to do is to get my code into the centralized code repository. So let's push the code into it. Well, as it made into the GitHub, let's see if Travis has actually detected that. So I got my Travis set up here. See the yellow one that actually detected? It's trying to kick off an auto build for me. While Travis is busy trying to booting up the virtual machine, why don't we take a closer look at what Travis is trying to do, exactly all the instruction it's trying. So we're going to take a closer look on the YAML, Travis YAML file. Travis YAML file is just a configuration file or build file. Basically, it just tells Travis what exactly you're going to do. So we said we need a Salesforce CLI as our scripting tool. And these 3 lines here actually installed the Salesforce CLI tool. And you will notice I'm actually using a pre-release branch. So this is our latest one. And it will become available as a release as part of the Summer 19 offer next month. So be sure to check that out. And then we said we need to be able to headlessly authenticate into our production org. So this auth JWT grant command is actually doing that. Now that we've already satisfied all the prerequisites, let's take a look at the script section. So if you remember when Rohit was talking about the pain point, one of them was there was no easy scriptable interface to manage sandboxes. Well, sure, we have APIs, but they're not that easy to use. Well, as part of the Summer 19 offer, we now actually have a couple of Salesforce CLI command can manage sandbox lifecycle. As you can see here, I'm actually using the org create command right here to create a sandbox by specifying the type of the org I want is sandbox. And also, I can use the -u here to tell it, hey, create a sandbox for this production org. This is an alias which I set it up in the previous command. And then you can tell us the sandbox name, the type of the sandbox, either in a sandbox definition file or do what I have here, just pass them onto the command line as argument. And then I want to give it an alias to the resulting sandbox. And sandbox creation takes time. So I gave it a wait time of 60 minutes. So when this command finishes, what do I get? I get a most up-to-date replica of your production data in terms of the metadata. So that means you won't be risking running your tests on some stale sandbox environment. But if you always want to run your tests from some known starting point, or if you already have some pre-configured sandbox, you can also use the org clone command, which is very similar to the org create command, The main difference is you just need to tell us what's your source sandbox name to clone from, so we will apply the right license to it. And then we also have a org status command that will allow you to monitor the sandbox progression. So if you remember the pain point, in my opinion, I think the biggest pain point is that you have to manually log into Sandbox. So that breaks up the automation. Well, I'm happy to say we put some magic beans around these commands. So all these three commands, the create, the clone, and the status, towards the end, when the sandbox creation finishes successfully, in other words, when the sandbox status goes into completed state, we will try to automatically authenticate the requester into the newly created sandbox. And we're doing that using the same connected app that you have already set up on your production org. We're even using the same client ID or consumer key to authenticate that sandbox user. So now we got our sandboxes. I want to get my code, my killer feature, into the sandbox to test them out. So I want to deploy my source code from GitHub into it. I'm using the source deploy here. Wait a minute. Did I forget to specify package.xml? Actually, that's another improvement as part of the summer 19. You no longer need to explicitly specify package.xml. As long as you tell us the location of your source, we'll actually generate a package.xml for you. Or if your company does package development, you can use the package install command over here to get your metadata into your sandbox. So now you've got your sandbox, you've got your metadata into your sandbox. What is there left to do? Just to run the integration tests with Apex run, right? And off you go. We're hoping for the best. So now let's go back to Travis to see how far has it gone. So it's still running. And let's take a look at this. As you can see, somewhere earlier, okay, it installed Salesforce CLI, it authenticated, it actually kicked off a sandbox creation command to create the sandbox. But of course, we don't want to sit here all day long to wait for the sandbox to finish. So let's go to our production org to see if this sandbox shows up. So let me refresh this page. All right, I see it. TDX demo, that's the sandbox I created in my CI. It's been queued up, waiting to be picked up. So this is the same as if your admin did it from the admin UI. Thank you. Back to you, Rohit.
Thanks, Jing. So I know what you're all thinking. Well, sandboxes take a long time to create. Do we really want to wait 60 minutes for every CI build? Well, this is why we are working on a next generation of sandboxes called the Lightning Sandboxes. If you came to Dreamforce last year, you heard us mention about this, and we started a pilot for a select group of test users. In summer 19, we will be extending that pilot and continue testing out the sandbox. This sandbox has a feature called quick cloning, which lets you create a sandbox in less than 5 minutes. It's meant to improve productivity, accelerate your testing, and make those CI builds run much faster. One of the changes that we have actually added to Lightning Dev Pro Sandboxes in order to suit CI better is we've removed the refresh interval that you've previously had with all of your existing sandbox types. So if you've ever had to wait 24 hours to delete or refresh a developer or developer pro sandbox, you won't have those intervals with the Lightning Developer Pro Sandbox. Sandboxes can be created and then deleted right after every CI build. So in addition to all the different features and enhancements that we've added in summer 19, we have a bunch of cool, exciting features that we're working in the next 2 releases. In winter 20, we will be working on making the Sandbox CLI commands GA. We'll also be working on improving some of the post-copy experience so that we can automate as many bits as possible for you. Please speak to us after this session so that we can understand where you'd like to see improvements. We're also working on simplifying the preview experience so you no longer have to look at a blog to tell what dates are going to, what dates to follow to track the upgrade of a sandbox to preview. In addition, there's going to be some exciting announcements around Lightning Sandboxes, which I'm going to withhold for now, because you'll be excited when you come to Dreamforce and then the next release after that. So with that, I just want to say thank you to all for coming over. I will be down below at the stage if you have any questions or any other questions or concerns or clarifications that you need. Thank you.